Hi and welcome back. So now we're going to look at something called property decorators. So we've studied properties already, so we should have a good understanding of what properties are and how they work, and basically how they allow us to specify getter and setter methods. Now this property is a class object, so it's a type, so it can be instantiated in any way that we instantiate regular objects or regular classes. So in particular, we can instantiate a property by specifying fget and fset. We've seen how to do that before. And then if we put that inside a class, x becomes the property name, right? The attribute name of this property object in our class. Now this class actually defines other methods as well. So the property class has a method called getter, a method called setter, and a method called deleter. And we can pass basically a callable or a function, if you will, to those methods. And that what it does is that it will then return a property object with the getter defined to whatever we specified as the argument to the getter method, right? So basically it's a way to set the fget, fset, and fdelete methods, right? But now using methods on the property itself. So instead of doing the property this way that we have over here, we could do it this way instead. We could just say x is a property. That's it. But we haven't defined the methods to use for the getter and setter methods or the delete methods. Now I can use the getter method of x to specify what to use for the get. And so here I'd say x equals x.getter get x. Remember, this x.getter is going to return a property that will have the getter set to get x. Now I can again call it, but this time I'm going to call the setter method on x, and I'm going to pass it another function. So now it's going to set the setter method to set x, and the getter method will be still get x. It knows that from before, and it's going to return a property object that will now have the setter and the getter defined, and so on. So we could also do it this way. We could start and just specify property with just get x. So I've just specified the getter here, right? That's the first fget, basically the first argument in this initializer. So I can do it that way as well. And then I can say x equals x.setter and then pass it set x. So we have all these different ways that we can create these property objects. And then even if we've created the property object and it doesn't have all the data that it needs for the getter and the setter and the deleter, we can incrementally add to it as we go along by using these methods, getter, setter, deleter. So let's take a look at this class again. So we could start this way. We could define a function. So this is going to be basically a method when it gets called from the object, and we call it language. Now I redefine language. I'm saying language is now equal to, and I'm going to create a property object, passing it language, which is this function over here, as the getter. So we now have a property language with a getter method defined. Now does this remind you of decorators? Remember how we use decorators? A decorator, that at symbol, is basically just a way of passing one function into another function, and then the returned function from that decorator gets reassigned to the same value. So that's exactly what we're doing here. So property is in fact a decorator as well. It can act as a decorator. So we can write it this way instead. Instead of writing it in these two steps over here, we use the shorthand notation for decorators, and we decorate it at property def language. It's going to do exactly what we have over here. It's first going to create this function language. Then it's going to call property, passing it language, and whatever gets returned will get reassigned to the symbol language. So now the language is an attribute of our class that happens to be a property object, a property instance. So we may also want to define a setter method as well. So let's start again with our class, and we have this property, right, that we use the decorator for to define a property that will have the getter be this function language. So at this point, language is a property instance, right? We have a property instance in our class. So now we could create this function over here called set language. And set language is going to be our setter. And this is the setter method. It will be called as a method when we call it from the instance. but we want to assign it to the language property, right? That property object. We want to now say to that property object, hey, by the way, here's a set function that you should use. Well, how do we do that? We call the setter method of that property object. So language.setter, and we tell it which method to use. In this case, we're giving it this function setLanguage. So now we have a new property called language that has a getter method, which is going to be this method language, right, or this function, but when it's called, it will be called as a bound method. And then the setter is this function over here, setLanguage. And when it gets called, it also will be called as a bound method. But again, does this remind you maybe of decorators, right? So again, we can use the decorator syntax. We can say language.setter, that's the function that we want. We want to pass it setLanguage, and then we want to reassign whatever gets returned from this, which remember at that point will be what? It will be a property object that has the setLanguage defined for the setter, and since language already had the getter method defined, it will also have the getter method defined. So now what gets returned from language.setter is a property with both the set and get methods defined. And then we get that back and put it back into language. So we can decorate it as @language.setter and then give it the name that we want our property to have. Now this is important, this name matters, okay? And we'll see that in the code. I'll show you examples of what happens when we don't use the same name here. So if you find this confusing, maybe another way to look at it, I'm not saying it's less confusing, and it will get clearer when we do the code. But another way that we could look at it is doing it this way, is really breaking things up into their individual components. So let's start by creating a property called language. And here I'm defining the get method, right? When I use this @property, it means create a property object, pass language as the argument to that object, and then reassign whatever that property instance is to the symbol language in my class. Next, I'm going to create a temporary variable, essentially, still in my class. So this is a class attribute. I'm going to create a temporary variable in my class called langProp, and I'm going to set it equal to language. So basically now langProp is a pointer to this language property, this instance of a property type. Next, I'm going to define another function called language. So at this time, I'm going to redefine whatever language was. So right now, langProp and language are both pointing to the same property object. Now I'm redefining language. So now language is going to point to a function, okay? And this is my language function. So I just redefined that symbol. Next, I'm going to take my original property, langProp, and I'm going to call its setter method, passing it this function called language. So that's going to be now the set method for the property. And I'm going to reassign that now to language. So now language has been reassigned. Language is now again a property, right? So language started as a property, language became a function, and then language became a property again. I'm just redefining what that symbol points to at every step of the way. So you'll notice here, I defined the getter. Here, I created a property that now has both the getter from here and the new setter, and now I've reassigned it to language. So at this point, language is an attribute in my class that is a property object. And then finally, I'm going to delete this temporary langProp. I don't need it anymore, so I'm going to delete it from my class attributes. I'm just going to say del langProp. So you can think of it as working that way as well. So to summarize, right, at the end of the day, we just need to learn the pattern of how we use these decorators to create property types. But just keep in mind that all it is we're creating instances of these property objects, and we're defining the getter and the setter, and then potentially the deleter and the docstring as well if we want to. The docstring goes along when we set up the getter method, and I'll show you that in the code. So to define the get method and a property, we do an @property decorator on any function. Now the function will be called as a method, so we need to account for that. The first argument is going to be the bound object, and then we do whatever we want to do with the getter. In this case, I'm just going to return the private, the pseudo-private backing variable. Next, when we have that, in order to define the setter method, we have to use again a decorator. We're going to use whatever the name is currently of our property. In this case, our property name currently is language. So I'm going to use that property language.setters method as a decorator. So at language.setter, and I'm going to decorate another function called language. Now, why is it called language? Well, remember what the decorator syntax does. It basically decorates this function and reassigns the result of the decorator to the same symbol. So I want my property to be called language. I don't want it to be called, language 2. I want it to be called language. So I'm going to have to define this function here to have the same name, language. But that's pretty straightforward to remember, right? You have two different definitions of functions that have the same name, but because they're being run through these decorators, it's okay. Because whatever this function was created, that exists in memory, this property, this language property, has a pointer to that function in memory, not to the name. It doesn't care about what the name was. It just needs to know what function is it. And the same thing with the setter. The setter now is going to basically take this function here, wherever it is in memory. It's going to be a different function than this one, but it's going to be in memory somewhere. And the set method, right, the set property, I should say, of this language property is going to be that method, that new method that I've just created here, this def language. So the function name defines the property instance name. That's just a symbol. The language is now at this point a property instance, right? It's an object, an instance of the property type. Now we use the setter method of that language property object, and it's important to use the same name. And I'll show you that in the code. Speaking of which, let's switch to code and let's try all this out. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a bit.